Millennium 1989 wasn't just another forgotten time travel movie from the end of the decade. It was a 10-year nightmare that destroyed a sci-fi writer's Hollywood dreams.
I think that film is going to turn out very well.
The producer was a convicted forger who'd embezzled from Judy Garland. The crash set was so real that pilots thought people were dying, and the star only got hired because her marriage gave her a Canadian passport. These are 15 facts about Hollywood's most cursed production. 1. The screenplay was rewritten 6 times for 4 different directors. Writer John Varley had his short story, Air Raid, optioned in 1979 and thought he'd found his Hollywood breakthrough. Instead, he spent the next decade trapped in development hell, rewriting the same screenplay over and over as directors came and went. First, Douglas Trumbull signed on, then quit. Then Randall Kleiser, who directed Grease. Then Richard Rush. Each time a new director arrived, Varley had to sit through meetings, listen to their vision, and start from scratch. By the time cameras finally rolled in 1988, he'd written 6 complete versions of the same story. Varley later admitted that with each rewrite, something was gained, but more was lost, until by the final shooting script, most of his original vision had disappeared. He eventually gave up waiting and turned his screenplay into a novel in 1983, which got nominated for a Hugo Award. The movie that finally came out 6 years later was nothing like what he'd imagined. 2. The producer had been convicted of embezzling $75,000. The man who finally got Millennium made was David Beagleman through his company Gladden Entertainment, and he had one of the most bizarre criminal records in Hollywood history. In 1977, Beagleman got caught forging a $10,000 check with actor Cliff Robertson's signature while running Columbia Pictures. When Columbia investigated, they discovered he'd embezzled an additional $65,000 through other forged checks. Even more shocking, in 1993 it was revealed that Beagleman had stolen several $100,000 from Judy Garland in the 1960s, writing checks to cash that he cashed at Las Vegas casinos. He also convinced Garland to pay $50,000 for a non-existent nude photo that blackmailers supposedly had. The check went straight to Beagleman's personal account. Despite being convicted, Hollywood welcomed him back, and he kept producing movies while continuing to defraud investors right up until his 1995 suicide in a Los Angeles hotel room. 3. Cheryl Ladd got the role because of her Canadian passport. To get Canadian tax incentives, Millennium needed Canadian cast and crew members, which created a casting problem since the leads were supposed to be American. The producer solved it with a technicality. Cheryl Ladd had married actor David Ladd in 1973, and through that marriage she qualified for Canadian citizenship. David was the son of legendary actor Alan Ladd, which made Cheryl part of a Hollywood dynasty. By the time Millennium filmed in 1988, Cheryl and David had divorced 8 years earlier, and she'd remarried music producer Brian Russell. But the Canadian passport from her first marriage was still valid. Without that marriage to David Ladd, the entire production would have needed to recast the female lead or film somewhere else entirely. Director Michael Anderson also counted as Canadian crew, which is why he got hired despite his reputation for ruining science fiction movies like Logan's Run and The Martian Chronicles. 4. Pilots kept reporting the crash set. As a real disaster production designer, Gene Rudolph built a full-scale Boeing 747 crash site using actual airplane debris and wreckage in Kleinburg, just north of Toronto. The set was so convincing that commercial pilots on approach to Toronto Pearson International Airport spotted it from the air and immediately radioed air traffic control to report what looked like a fresh crash. This happened multiple times during filming, forcing the production to coordinate with aviation authorities to warn every incoming flight that the wreckage wasn't real. Controllers had to repeatedly assure panicked pilots that no actual crash had occurred. The set required 93 carpenters, 57 painters, and 4,000 sheets of plywood to construct. Rudolph wanted everything to look like actual disaster footage, down to the scorch marks and bent metal, which meant pilots genuinely couldn't tell the difference from 2,000 feet up. 5. Paul Newman and Jane Fonda were the original stars. Back in the late 1970s, when the project first got going, this wasn't going to be a low-budget Canadian tax shelter movie. MGM was producing, visual effects legend Douglas Trumbull was directing, and heavyweight stars Paul Newman and Jane Fonda were supposedly attached to play the leads. Trumbull had revolutionized special effects with 2001, A Space Odyssey, and was coming off directing Silent Running. With those names attached, Millennium looked like it might be a major science fiction event. Then Natalie Wood died during the filming of Trumbull's Brainstorm in 1981, and MGM briefly shut down that production. Trumbull went to the press and complained loudly about how the studio was handling things, which was considered an unforgivable sin in Hollywood. MGM dropped him immediately, and when Trumbull left, Newman and Fonda disappeared too. The project that had started as a potential blockbuster ended up as a bargain basement production 9 years later. 6. John Varley called it the only bad result from his Hollywood years. During the late 1980s and most of the 1990s, Varley stopped writing novels and took an office at the MGM studio gate, working as a Hollywood screenwriter. He later said he made a lot of money during those years, but grew completely disenchanted with the film industry. In interviews, he took full responsibility for how Millennium turned out, saying, "Only one movie resulted from this time, and it was bad." After spending a decade watching his vision get diluted through endless rewrites and director changes, Varley reportedly blamed himself rather than the system. His novel output during this period basically stopped. He published Steel Beach in 1992 and The Golden Globe in 1998, but otherwise the Hollywood years were a creative wasteland. The irony was that his novel version of Millennium got critical praise and award nominations, while the movie he'd sacrificed years to develop became a box office disaster that damaged his reputation in both industries. 7. The future set was built. In an abandoned transformer factory. Gene. Rudolph needed to create a future world that looked like humanity's last gasp, and he found the perfect location in an abandoned transformer factory in Toronto. The time traveler's home base became an enormous set measuring 250 feet long and 65 feet high, with rusted catwalks traversing a massive open space. Rudolph painted the walls in dull greens, blacks, and copper tones to make everything look sick and poison. Buildings were designed to appear crumbling with exposed infrastructure. The council members who oversaw the time travel operation sat in a semicircle of 7 transparent, upright cylinders that served as life support devices. Only 4 of the cylinders actually held actors because of budget constraints. Rudolph wanted the future to feel like humanity had destroyed itself through pollution and nuclear war, with survivors barely clinging to existence in a rotting world. The whole aesthetic was meant to show a civilization falling apart. 8. The gate time travel effect used spinning wheels. Covered in mylar for the shimmering ghostly lights that represented the time travel gate, cinematographer Rene Ohashi couldn't afford sophisticated special effects, so he got creative with practical solutions. He produced the effect by spinning metal wheels that were covered entirely in mylar reflective material. When lit properly and filmed at the right speed, the spinning mylar created swirling patterns of light that looked otherworldly and technological. It was the same kind of low-budget ingenuity that characterized the entire production. The time travel sequences needed to look futuristic and beyond current technology, but the production didn't have the money for computer graphics or complex optical effects. Ohashi's solution was elegant and cheap, using materials you could buy at any hardware store. The effect worked well enough that audiences accepted it as advanced technology from 1,000 years in the future, even though it was literally just spinning mirrors. 9. 2 completely different endings were shot for different markets. The North American version ended with a simple shot of the gate exploding, followed by sunrise over clouds, leaving the fate of the main characters ambiguous. But international audiences got a completely different ending that was much more explicit and optimistic. In the international cut, the gate explosion is shown from a wider angle, followed by a wormhole time portal effect. Then, Bill and Louise materialize in what looks like the Garden of Eden in the far future, swimming up from underwater before falling into each other's arms in a nude embrace. The international version made it clear that they survived and reached paradise together, while the American version left everything uncertain. The 1999 North American DVD included both versions, with the international ending as a bonus feature. Netflix later used the North American ending. Nobody involved in the production ever explained why two radically different endings were necessary. 10. The ending. Quote was Winston Churchill. But nobody credited him. In the final scene, the robot character Sherman says, "This is not the end. This is not even the beginning of the end. It is the end of the beginning." Those lines were paraphrased directly from Winston Churchill's November 10th, 1942 speech at the Lord Mayor's Luncheon, where he used similar language to describe the turning tide of World War II. But the film never credited Churchill for the quote, "Just let it hang there as if it were original dialogue." Critics noted this as one of the movie's jarring elements, with the uncredited Churchill quote sounding comical and out of place. It didn't fit the tone of anything that came before it, and felt like someone had inserted inspirational words they'd found in a book of famous quotations. 11. Scott Thompson from Kids. In the Hall had a bit part, and later made fun of it. Canadian comedian Scott Thompson, who would become famous as part of the Kids in the Hall comedy troupe, played a small role in Millennium during the production's time in Toronto. He later discussed the experience in a sketch on the Kids in the Hall while performing as his character Buddy Cole, openly making fun of his involvement in the movie. Thompson's appearance was brief enough that most people missed it entirely, but for him it became memorable enough to turn into comedy material. The fact that one of the cast members later mocked the film on television gives you some idea of how the production was viewed even by people who worked on it. 12. The film shot. At Toronto Pearson Airport terminals that no longer exist. All the airport terminal sequences were filmed at the former terminals 1 and 2 of Toronto Pearson International Airport, which have both since been demolished and replaced with newer facilities. For one outdoor scene where Louise steals a car, the production actually ran two-way traffic in front of the Terminal 2 arrivals level, where normally it was a one-way road. The airport granted special permission to change traffic patterns just for filming, which must have confused actual travelers trying to navigate the area that day. The production took full advantage of Toronto's cooperation, essentially taking over sections of a working international airport for days at a time. Those old terminals represented the visual aesthetic of late 1980s commercial aviation with their dated architecture and design. 13. The movie got 5 Genie Award nominations, but won nothing. Despite its problems, Millennium received 5 nominations at the 1990 Genie Awards, which are Canada's equivalent of the Oscars. It was nominated for Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Cinematography, Best Sound Editing, Best Overall Sound, and Best Costume Design. The recognition made sense given how much of the production was Canadian talent working with Canadian money and Canadian locations. But when the awards were handed out, Millennium went home empty-handed in every category. The only award the film ever won was from the Canadian Society of Cinematographers for Best Cinematography in a theatrical feature, which at least acknowledged Rene Ohashi's creative work with limited resources. The Genie nominations and the Cinematography Award represented professional acknowledgement from the Canadian film industry that people had done good work under difficult circumstances, even if the final product didn't succeed commercially or critically. 14. Bill Smith was supposed to become director of the NTSB. According to John Varley's original manuscript and the novel, the character of Bill Smith had a critical role in history that extended far beyond the events shown in the film. Smith was destined to become director of the National Transportation Safety Board, making him historically important in ways the time travelers understood, but the audience never fully learned. This backstory helped explain why Louise's interactions with him created such dangerous paradoxes. If Smith's future contributions were significant enough, then any changes to his timeline could have catastrophic ripple effects. But the movie cut most of this context, leaving viewers confused about why Smith mattered so much to the future. 15. The production used real plane debris to build the crash site. Gene. Rudolph didn't just mock up airplane parts from scratch. The crash site set incorporated actual debris and components from decommissioned aircraft, which added to the authenticity that fooled pilots flying overhead. The production gathered wreckage from scrap planes and carefully arranged it to match what a real mid-air collision would produce. They even pre-burned some of the materials to simulate fire damage, since the plot required passengers to appear charred before the crash actually happened. Eyewitnesses who saw the set without knowing a film was being made reportedly found it shocking and disturbing, thinking they were looking at the aftermath of a real tragedy. If you made it through all 16 facts, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments which behind-the-scenes disaster shocked you the most. Was it the convicted forger producer, or those pilots calling in fake crashes? See you next time.